Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Julie Roginski. I'm here with Olga Lautman, who runs two incredible newsletters that if you don't subscribe to, you absolutely should. The Trump Tyranny Tracker, which is like a must read every day about how Donald Trump is basically driving us in, not basically, he's driving us into tyranny on a daily basis, and she's tracking all of that. And also Unmasking Russia, which is such a critical incredible source of information about all things Russia and what they are doing, not just to our country, but certainly also to Ukraine, Western Europe, and the world, because Mitt Romney was right about one thing. Vladimir Putin is the greatest threat to national security in this country and world stability. He always has been. And here we are, part of now the Russian axis of evil as the United States, which I was never a Ronald Reagan supporter, but if you were, he must be rolling over in his grave, as would any Republican not named Donald Trump. Thank you all so much for joining us. Olga, it is so wonderful to have you here. I've been such a fan of your work for so long and reached out.
Likewise.
Yeah, and just reached out and finally said, we got to talk because I wrote this newsletter over the weekend that I posted on Monday about how like something's really off about this former KGB spy, the former head of the Kazakhstan intelligence service, saying that Trump was a Russian asset. And I didn't realize it was going to get this much play, but it got a tremendous amount of play. And you have been tracking this for years. So I actually want to just ask you to walk us through the history here. And I think actually starting with, before we even get to Trump, starting with his marriage to Ivana Trump, who I think doesn't get as much attention about these things, and how we got from Donald Trump being some rando from Queens to suddenly being the guy who's making us, the United States, side with Russia, North Korea, Belarus, and other not so great countries against all of our former allies and against the very brave people of Ukraine. So take it away. Tell us what we need
First
to
of
know.
all, your piece was amazing. I went
Yeah.
through it and I mean, it was so on point. And it's very interesting that this Kazakh KGB spy agent came out again to say this because this yet again shows that they're sending a reminder to Trump. They did the same thing in 2016. And now, between actual threats with senior levels of the Russian government, all voicing their concerns that Trump will get assassinated. Um, to now this, it's very interesting. So you're right. It does begin with Ivana. Ivana had migrated to Canada as a ice skater, I believe.
I think
Uh,
skier. I think she was a skier.
skier,
Yeah.
skier, and I think it was over a decade ago that the STB, which was an intelligence agency and a satellite of KGB, had opened their intelligence files. And what was there was, I mean, beyond fascinating. So basically, the STB targeted Trump after Ivana married him in '77. That's when they opened the file. They monitored Trump basically, I believe, until '89. That was the last time that agents actually traveled to the US and were met with Trump to discuss some deal. With this, Ivana was an informant for the STB and providing information on the politics in the United States. And so was her father. And she used to travel back and forth with Don Jr. and Ivanka at the time, back to Czechoslovakia. And basically,
Could I just pause for a second? Because I don't know that people realize this, but Olga and I both, well, I was born in the former Soviet Union. Olga's parents also were emigres like I was, refugees. You were born, Olga, on the way after your parents had left the Soviet Union, but before you arrived here in the United States. But I just want people to understand that Ivana left Czechoslovakia because she married an Austrian ski instructor, and that ski instructor, by virtue of being from the West, she was able to leave. Which, first and foremost, that's unusual. That is not what typically happened. If you
yep.
married somebody from the West, you were not automatically allowed to just go. What's fascinating also is that she was allowed to repeatedly come back and visit her family. And I
Hmm.
can tell you from personal experience that once you left and you became a traitor to the nation, which is what they considered anybody who would leave for the West, right? You were not just allowed to come back and forth. I don't care who
Yep.
you were. You were persona non grata. You lost your citizenship. Your parents would have been deprived of their jobs. They would have been shunned as people who were the parents of somebody who decided to effectively defect to
And
the West
arrested.
and arrested. So for her to just be able to come back and forth like the way that she did is not just deeply unusual, but if that's not the biggest tell of all, I don't know what is. I can tell you from personal experience when we left in 1980, we were not allowed to, my mother and I were not allowed to come back and see my grandparents until 1988. And that's all only because of glasnost and because things had, changed. In the 1970s, when Ivana did this under the Brezhnev regime, which basically oversaw the Eastern satellites, there was no way in hell
Nope.
that she would have been allowed to just, oh, okay, you left, no problem. You can keep coming back and visiting your family. I mean, never. So the fact that she was able to do this should have raised red flags from day one. So sorry, continue. I just want people to know that because they may not
That
know
is
that,
an excellent point. And also, she didn't relinquish her citizenship,
which
which
you're
is
deprived
another,
of
yeah,
automatically.
which is another tell. And I mean, anyone who managed to get out of the hellhole of the Soviet Union, I mean, never, ever would even have a thought to come back. I mean, even after the collapse of the Union, people then even still had that trepidation to, go
Oh,
back and to see family. I mean, so I absolutely. So then she was the STB was monitoring everything. I mean, even to the point that her and Donald Trump had a prenup agreement. Um, that how many kids they were going to have. I mean, even personal details of their marriage. The KGB took interest in this, and the KGB oversaw the STB in Prague, and the files were also moved over to the KGB. And that's pretty much when Trump was directly targeted by the KGB. And then by the 80s, interestingly enough, you start seeing Russian mafia. The first one was David Bokedin, who came in 1984. He came to the United States, I believe, in '77 with like $1 or $2 in his pocket. In 1984, he walked in with $6 million in cash, personally buying apartments from Trump in Trump Tower. And then from there, it just went off. If you look at Trump, which I went through every single Trump property a decade ago, from Sunny Isles to New York, I mean, I would say 90% of it is money laundering and the movement of money from Russian mafia, from Russian officials, from officials linked to Yanukovych, the treasonous, former president in Ukraine. Um, and this is how he made his money. Interestingly enough, um, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, like every single agent from Ames to Hansen to everyone who just went dry, Trump went bankrupt, and he had a series of bankruptcies. And then you start seeing the money being infused back into his businesses in around 97, 98. And this was at a time that Hansen became active, and this was at a time when Putin took over the FSB, which is the former KGB. And from the looks of it, looks like they went through old files from the Soviet Union to see who else could be reapproached and reactivated. And Hansen becomes active. Trump starts getting a huge infusion of money. Um, at the time, he started doing several projects in the United States with the Russians, and then overseas in Kazakhstan and other Russian friendly countries. So this is a very, very long history with them. And the fact, I mean, then to go back to the 80s, in around 85, he was then targeted in New York, at least according to people I have spoken to a decade ago. He was targeted in New York through the Soviet mission to UN. By 87, he gets an invitation to go to Moscow and St. Petersburg at the time, Leningrad, to build, basically discuss Trump Towers. This trip was organized by the KGB, by
Always.
Intourist, which
They,
was an arm of the K. It was
they,
a
they, they all were.
unit of,
Yeah.
yep. And he met with senior Soviet officials at the time. I mean, you know better as well as I do, in 87 to discuss putting gaudy towers in a communist country. I mean, the whole thing is ludicrous. And from there he kept going back. When he did come back in 87, there are two interesting points. One, he wanted to run for president, and him and Roger Stone formed an exploratory committee and went to New Hampshire to see what the chances are. Meanwhile, Ivana was feeding back information on the potential race and who might win. And this was marked in the STB files that she, went to Czechoslovakia, told them that Bush had a good chance of winning and whatnot. So they were getting, like, information from her at the same time. And two, he from anyone who's in from New York. I mean, the man was a very cheap man. He spent his money taking out ads in national papers, basically attacking our alliances, Japan and our alliances, and literally word for word to what he says about NATO and our alliances now. This is what he did when he came back from the Soviet Union. I mean, these were straight KGB talking points. And the third thing that not too many people know about, he was beyond obsessed with Gorbachev. He was so obsessed with Gorbachev that he actually found his American doctor. And when this doctor came back to the US, he flew him for lunch to get all the information he can about Gorbachev. Um,
Why?
and
Do you have a sense of why he was so obsessed with him?
I'm not sure. It's very weird. I don't know if he was trying to collect information on him for KGB, if he was, just obsessed with the Soviet Union. Another thing people don't know, he wanted to post to the Soviet Union as an ambassador in the 80s. So, I mean, he had this, maybe through Ivana, maybe Ivana was filling his head on the Soviet Union. I'm not sure why, but these are not normal things of an American New York businessman who deals with real estate. Um, and then that's it. And then by the 90s, he went back again for the Trump Tower. Interestingly enough, he came back from the Trump Tower discussions and again wanted to run for president. So every time he visited the Soviet Union or Russia to discuss this Trump Tower, which frankly, I don't believe there were even discussions of Trump Tower deals. I think it was a way to move more money. What better way than to sign contracts and move money? And then you saw during the 2016 election again the whole Trump Tower discussion with his Michael Cohen and Felix Sater, who were dealing with the Russians on behalf during election. So I mean, the man is compromised. I'm not sure what happened to our security services, what happened to our law enforcement, where they were the past, several decades. The last thing I'll say on this is during the 2000 like 5, 6, 7, 8 period, there were three major operations running out of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. One was an international gambling ring for this Russian mobster Taiwan chick, Dr. Honov, who at the time had his people and they were running this international gambling ring. And he ended up being actually VIP at Miss Universe Moscow a few years after that. Two, you had Felix Sater running a whole operation laundering money for for Kazakhstan officials. And three, you had this tenant, which I really believe is the 500-pound hacker that he used to refer to, Chuck Blazer, who was 500 pounds, who was involved in the, what is it, the FIFA scandal
Right.
for Putin. So you had these three things happening at the same time in the late 2000s. And that's it. I mean, with him, we can do literally a series on every single connection and every single
Well, I'll,
event that took place.
I'll tell you what I find fascinating, because sometimes the most obvious stuff is the stuff right in front of you, right? And we have all of these people wondering, was he not? But you only have to look at, I went down this rabbit hole, and sometimes it helps to speak the Russian language so you can kind of read it, in its original language, which both you and I do. But what I found fascinating was a woman named Natalia Dubinina, who was the daughter of, was that Andrei Dubinin? Is that his first name? Yeah,
Yep,
who was
Yuri Dubinin. Hmm.
yeah, who was so Dubinin was the first ambassador to the United Nations, the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations, and then shortly thereafter became the Soviet ambassador to the United States. But his daughter, had already been. This is going back to 19, I believe it's 1986. She was posted to the UN mission here in New York. Um, and you have to forgive me because I'm going to go through a little bit of New York geography for this, for people who are not from New York, to have this make sense to you, because it makes no sense if you know New York geography and if you lived here in the 80s, which Olga and I both did. So she had already been posted to the mission at the UN, and she tells this story to a Soviet, to a Russian newspaper now, but that then a Soviet newspaper called Komsomolskaya Pravda. And what she says is that her father arrived in New York. He had never been here before. She picked him up from the airport. He's now the ambassador. He's now been named the ambassador to the UN mission here in New York. She picks him up at the airport. Now, if you know New York geography, she picks him up either at JFK, which is in the east of Manhattan, or she picked him up in Newark. I don't think so in the 80s, but most likely JFK. But let's suppose she picked him up at maybe Newark, which is in New Jersey, west of Manhattan. Regardless, whichever way you come into the city, the first thing you do not hit is Trump Tower. Trump Tower is smack dab in the middle of Manhattan. It is on 57th and 5th. It is nowhere near JFK. It is nowhere near Newark. And most importantly, it is 10 blocks south of the Soviet mission, which is on 67th, between 3rd and Lexington Avenue and 3rd Avenue. So I say all of this kind of geography that's a little weird for people, because you have to kind of picture what she's describing, how ludicrous it is. According to her, she picks up her dad from the airport. And before she does anything else, after he's taken this intercontinental trip, she takes him on a tour of New York City. Okay, first and foremost, that's BS, but let's assume that we take her at her word. The first building they see in New York is Trump Tower. Now, if you have ever been to New York and you've seen Trump Tower, it is not even close to a building that stands out. It is mid-sized for where it is. It is not the Empire State Building. It is not the Chrysler Building. It is not what used to be the World Trade Center, all of which stood out a lot more back in 1986. But he is so blown away by this building, which is not on its way to the Soviet mission from either airport, that he makes her stop the car. Because he must meet the owner of Trump Tower. Trump Tower is, you can love Trump or you could hate Trump. It is a totally ordinary building. There is nothing unique about it. It is across the street from the Plaza Hotel, which Trump owned at the time, I believe. That's a beautiful building. Trump Tower is not that. But he's so blown away by the beauty of Trump Tower, not the Empire State Building, not the Plaza, Trump Tower, that he goes in to Trump Tower and says, I must meet the man who built this place, and is taken up to Trump Tower, to the top of Trump Tower, to meet Donald Trump, who so happens to be there, who, of course, says, of course, I have nothing to do but to meet you, Ambassador Lubinin. Understand how stupid this is, what his own daughter says. And like, you have to be crazy and not know the first thing about anything, including New York geography, to understand how little this makes sense. So one of two things happen. Either this entire story is made up out of full cloth for whatever reason, or why was the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations casing Trump Tower as his first order of business upon arriving here in New York, as his assignment to be the Soviet representative to the United Nations? Why? What do you think, Olga? You
I
tell me.
can fill you in now because I
Yeah.
work on Russian intelligence
Yep.
operations, disinformation, and the whole hybrid warfare. First of all, the whole story is ludicrous. I
Of
mean,
course.
Dubanin is the one who offered the invitation for Trump to go to Moscow in 1987. He was being targeted through the Soviet mission in UN. But at the time, I mean, these days, these FSB agents are very like, I mean, they're just ridiculous. Like their predecessors, the KGB would look at them and say, "What is this?" But at that time, KGB was extremely trained. I mean, you weren't allowed to use the bathroom unless you got permission to use the bathroom. You weren't allowed to look a different way. The fact that, first of all, his daughter would be in New York picking up the airport, automatic KGB protocol, you were not allowed to have two family members in the same time outside of the country because of the fact that you were worried that these people would defect. And this was at the height of spy wars
Right.
when you had a lot of people defecting and family members being executed back at home. Um, do I believe that
But
they
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but they were in fact both here. So what does that tell you?
she was sent prior to him coming.
Right.
She
But
was here,
right.
and then she was sent prior to him coming. I think she probably left a few months prior to his arrival.
Mm,
What it tells me is that they were sending a message to Trump while basically masking the details of recruitment, not to identify people or whatnot, because she could have personally targeted him. It could have happened through another way, but by putting a semi truth story out, just like with this Kazakh KGB agent, what he is saying again, they're sending a message that you are one of ours, that we own you, but they're masking the real details of what happened, which is only locked in KGB files.
mm,
Um, so I do think that it was just a message because when she went back, I did a search on her. And mind you, what you said, just so people know, she put out this article 9 hours after Hillary Clinton conceded the election. So, I mean, this was done immediately after Hillary conceded the election. And when I looked into her, she went underground. When she went back to the Soviet Union, she was underground for decades. She came out, I believe it was like 2012 or 13, when her father, Dubanin, died, and she had to accept the award. They renamed the street after him. This was the first time she ever this. So the fact that they pulled her out within like what 30 something year period, once she went to her father's funeral and dealt with, all the awards, whatever, and then they pulled her out to give this story. So I believe they were sending a message to him. Another thing interesting about that time, the person who was working in a very sensitive KGB department in the Soviet mission, and she actually worked with him, was this guy Yakunin. And he was working for the Soviet mission. It eventually morphed into SVR because when KGB broke up, it went to FSB, which was the security and handling more of domestic intelligence and intelligence of countries like Kazakhstan, the Baltics, Ukraine, and then you have SVR that handles, the West, Africa, and whatnot. So Yakunian served in also here at the time recruiting and basically stealing technology and military secrets. They overlap. Now, Yakunian, the reason I'm saying his name, he is the one who is behind all the far right operations, moving now SVR agents, opening institutes. They had a Dialogue Franco-Russi Institute in France where they were basically recruiting French politicians, same thing in Germany, across all of Europe. This whole far right movement, him and this guy Malofeyev, they are behind it. And it overlaps a lot with the US. So the fact that he would have been aware of Trump also is a very interesting point because then, he went back to the Soviet Union and then eventually became head of the Russian railways, and then started these operations around 2010 to open up NGOs across Europe in order to recruit politicians and prop up and provide logistical and financial support to politicians from the far right. So that's another interesting pointer on that.
And it's interesting because you keep, and I want to talk about sort of the relationship now, but you did mention this recent revelation from last week, of a former head of the Kazakh intelligence service saying, who, let me give some background. He had defected, allegedly defected, with the son-in-law of the president of Kazakhstan. I want to say at least a decade ago, if not longer, to Austria. He claimed that at one point, Russian speaking men tried to kidnap him. He fought them off. He then went on trial for murdering two bankers in Kazakhstan, was acquitted. But the point is, this guy's got a colorful history, but he claimed that he had worked at a high ranking level at the KGB in the 80s before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He was an ethnic Kazakh, so he went back to Kazakhstan and became the head of their equivalent of the KGB before defecting to Austria, where he's apparently been allowed to live semi publicly for the last 10 to 15 years. But what is also fascinating about this is that he said that in 1987, Trump was recruited by the KGB, was given a code name of Krasnov,
Hmm.
um, whatever, and effectively has been on the Russian Soviet dole slash Russian dole ever since, and that these files are no longer in Russian intelligence. They're now managed exclusively by somebody who's very close to Putin because it's such a sensitive file. And then he's ended by saying, "I hope I don't get killed for saying this." So what do we make of this? Do we believe this? Do we not? And I want to just say this. Interestingly, the Daily Beast broke the story here in the United States. He posted this all on Facebook, so it's not really a story to break. He went public with it, but the Daily Beast picked it up almost immediately. The Daily Beast took the story down. Yahoo had reprinted the Daily Beast story. They took it down. Virtually no American media has covered it. It's been somewhat covered in Europe, but it's like the story went up and then it kind of disappeared. And unless you knew about this guy's Facebook page, which most of us don't follow this guy on Facebook, you would have blinked and you would have missed it because it's like radio silence. Now, it could be that they're afraid of being sued for libel, although they're just reporting on somebody else's allegations. So it's kind of a weird thing. And second, it's hard to sue for libel when it's the president of the United States, who's such a high profile figure. It's hard to libel a public figure like that. So I thought that was interesting that was being taken down by the Daily Beast immediately, which is owned by IAC, and the head of IAC is no fan of Trump. So I was kind of surprised about that. But what do you make of all of this? You think this guy really is a defector? You think this guy's still a Russian agent and he's sending a message? You think this is all a bunch of bull? What do we make of this?
So he does have a very high profile career. I mean, I looked into his career. He is who he is. He was posted where he was, said he was. I think he's still active because, I mean, anyone knows that if you defect from the KGB or defect from Kazakhstan, you don't run to Austria, which is basically still to this day a satellite of Russian intelligence.
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't even fly over Austria, or Belarus, or certain Russian-friendly countries, because we all saw what happened with the journalist a few years ago when he flew over from Spain on his way, I believe, to Lithuania, and the Belarusian fighter jets brought down the plane, made it land, and arrested the journalist, the Belarusian journalist. So, I
Yeah.
mean, frankly, anyone in their right mind, I mean, if you're going to defect, you go to London, you go to like a safer capital, not to, I mean,
Not to Vienna.
Austria.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically like going back to Moscow. Um, I do think he is still active, and I probably, again, I think he's sending a message to Trump. without revealing details. And just with Trump, the thing is that I believe he was recruited. I believe he is the Russian asset, of KGB and then later on FSB. But I don't think he was recruited in the normal sense of how people think of spies. I don't even know if he knows what he's doing.
He's like a useful
Um,
idiot, right?
like he's a useful, I mean, he knew what he was doing when he was laundering the money and when he's, repeating their propaganda. That he knew. But I think that because what happened is before, in up to 1984, the parameters for recruitment were like very specific. It was technological people, scientists, military people, CIA, FBI, or security services around the globe, politicians. It was a very specific group. In 1984, the head of the KGB, Khrushchev, expanded the recruitment. And he basically put out a memo because, again, during the spy wars between UK, US, and the Soviet Union, everyone on each side was losing a lot of spies. And the Soviet Union needed to replenish the spies. So he expanded it to anyone of influence. So businessmen, sports people. I mean, anyone who had any kind of influence was now approachable. So I think with Trump, not that they brought him and said, okay, this is what you're going to do for us. And then one day in 30 years, we're going to make you president. It did not work like that. I think he was just a very useful influence agent. They brought him there, filled his ear. And what a lot of people don't understand about how Russian intelligence operations work, and I mean, it even happens now with all these, people who work in think tanks, is Russia doesn't have to pay you and say, here's $10,000 check, you're going to say that Ukrainians are Nazis. What Russia does is they bring you to Moscow. They create your reality. So instead of feeding you what, I mean, they'll feed you what they want you to believe, but at the same time, they create your reality. And a perfect example of this, and this is like a very standard KGB part of the playbook, was in the late 1980s. They would bring Westerners there. Everyone knew that, in the Soviet Union, there was starvation. People were standing on bread lines and that there was no food in the supermarkets. So they would bring Westerners there and then take you to that person to two supermarkets that has like, kielbasa and everything
Mhm.
stacked and meat and fish and everything you can imagine. So now, did they basically tell the guy this is what you're going to say when you come back? No, the person will just report what they saw.
Well, that's what Tucker
And
Carlson, by the way, just be clear, that's what Tucker Carlson did last year when he went to Moscow. I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, went to Moscow. Same thing, I saw the cleanest streets. I saw these really happy people, like it was like this paradise on earth. Of course, they took him exactly where they wanted to take him and nowhere else, right? I mean, they didn't take him to the gulag to see where, Navalny was
no,
hanging out. So,
and they didn't
that's
take
absolutely
him
right.
30 kilometers outside of Moscow,
Yeah,
which is a shithole with,
right.
towns that are crumbling. And then maybe if you go 150 kilometers, they don't have toilets,
Yeah.
and still, live in poverty conditions. They take you to like the Crown Jewel, to the opera, they give you VIP treatment. So with Trump, I think they just, one, he was good because the KGB in the 80s, mid to late 80s, I mean, at the end of the day, they were intelligence. They were predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union, or at least they probably saw signs of it. So, starting around, like, I believe 85, 86, they started moving money out of the Soviet Union and managed to take, I believe, like $50 billion out. They needed avenues to take it out. So they had people in Canada, in the United States, across Europe to move this money out, and then store it. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the FSB was basically coming to, this is when they, started. They had the operational money to rebuild their operations and come back basically from the ashes. So this is another important factor. And he was a real estate guy, and real estate is the easiest way to move money. So I think they saw him as useful for certain things, putting out positive things about the Soviet Union, moving money for them. And basically what he's done over the past few decades. I mean, he was extremely involved. With even Russia in the 90s, later 90s, 2000s, and so forth, up to 2016, 2017, he still had money moving through. I mean, he had built Trump UN, Trump World Tower that frankly oversees UN and is a very interesting location. I think two-thirds of that building was all owned by either Yanukovych connected people from Party of Regions, which was the treasonous, president who fled Ukraine, and Russians. I mean, I think Kellyanne Conway was like the only, like one of the handful of Americans who owned property in that building. The rest were all from either Russia, Ukraine, or other, former Soviet hostages, as I call them.
So what do you make of all this? Because it's not, if you put all of this together, and I'm not a by the way, I'm totally not conspiratorially minded, so it's not like I'm sitting here looking for boogeymen hiding in my closet. But I mean, all of this makes sense, and especially it makes sense to people who are Russia experts like you. I don't know that people even know this, but my graduate degree was actually in post-Soviet economics. So I certainly studied, especially the Soviet era, very, very, very closely in a lot of detail. I was born there. You were almost born there. I would have been born there had your mom had you a few months earlier. So for those of us, if people like us who are not intelligence people can put this together, I assume that there are people who do this for a living who have put this together. And yet, why is this not more discussed? Do you think that Trump has just effectively run this whole Russia, Russia, Russia hoax so that people now are just afraid to say it because they don't want to look like they're stupid? Because they don't want to be made fun of because it's kind of like, oh, we already asked and answered that one. It's all a bunch of bull. The Steele dossier was a bunch of nonsense, which I don't think the Steele dossier was a bunch of nonsense. I think there were things in the Steele dossier that weren't proven, but certainly wasn't like the whole thing was a bunch of nonsense. But what is it that has prevented American intelligence, and especially Joe Biden in the 4 years that he was in office, where he had access to a lot of this data? What happened? What do you think?
I mean, this is the only thing I can't answer because for the average American to hear that Trump is an influence, agent or a Russian asset, it's like, oh my God, this is like, incredible. I mean, the region for anyone there, this is like another Tuesday. This is how
Mhm.
it operates. If it's in Ukraine, if it's in Estonia or Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, I mean, frankly, this is how things work there. I mean,
This
it's
it just by the way, for people who don't know, it just is. This isn't like us
No,
getting that,
no, this is for them. Here it's jaw dropping, but
it,
there, I mean, are you kidding? Like, 7 out of 10 people are on Russia's payroll, whether wittingly or
I mean, I can just
unwittingly.
tell you, I did say that I went back to Moscow in 1988 for the first time since leaving in 1980 to see my grandparents, who were they were known as refuseniks. They were not allowed to leave at the same time that we were, so we were sadly separated for a decade before they were able to come here. But we were allowed to go back, and I can tell you, I was 15 years old. We had KGB people following us everywhere we went, and it wasn't disguised. It was
No.
just it just was. And then I think my junior year in high school in 1990, we went back with my school. And again, Olga mentioned Interest. Interest was the Soviet tourist agency, all KGB, everybody who
Hmm.
was with us. Again, these were American students. I had been there before, nobody else had been. Took us to the most beautiful places, took us to the Bolshoi, went up to St. Petersburg, it was Leningrad at the time, took us to the Kirov Ballet. I mean, these are beautiful. If you've ever had the opportunity to have gone, you'll know what I'm talking about. I mean, stunning, beautiful places. Even back then, when it was still the Soviet Union, went to McDonald's, the first McDonald's in the Soviet Union, and we were able to get McDonald's. People were, the average Russian couldn't get McDonald's, but as far as we were shown, everybody was, living very, very well.
Yep.
So this isn't like unique to Donald Trump. It's just that Trump had something that they wanted, which is avarice and a loose moral compass, which are the two things that are really compromising for that's what they look for. They look for people who they can compromise, right? And it used to be that they would in the 60s, they would compromise people, not even compromise, they would get people to spy based on ideology, right? In the
Yep.
30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, if you believed in communism, you were like Kim Philby or something like that, you would spy for the Soviets because ideologically you agreed with them being a workers' paradise or whatever you
Yep.
thought they were. By the time the 70s and the 80s rolled around, they couldn't recruit people like that because people were kind of wise to what the Soviet Union was. So what they did was they looked for people that they could compromise based on the very Western values that they denigrated. They thought the West was decadent. They thought the West was avaricious. They thought the West was morally loose, kind of permissive. And here comes Donald Trump, Dec- decadent, really avaricious, and really morally corrupt. And you don't have to take that from me. Just look at any
And a
front page
narcissist.
and a
A very
narcissist.
key.
Look at every front page of the New York Post in the 1980s. You'll find out that Donald Trump boasted about all the women he slept with, all the money he was making. I mean, this guy was, and by the way, his taste in architecture is very Russian. Lots of gold, lots of glitz, lots of kind of gaudiness. I mean, he was like it was like if they couldn't have dreamt up a better person to try to compromise. And again, I agree with you. I don't think that he's like he's not Kim Philby. He's not like I will be a spy
No.
today for the Soviet Union. I don't think he even knows.
He's too untrained because they would recruit people like, who actually like former CIA and MI6. Those people had to be disciplined. Trump has no
Yeah.
discipline.
Mm.
He, just, I mean, how he rants now is how he ranted in the 80s. So they used him as an influence agent, and that's basically what we're seeing now, like across social media. All the people who are carrying on, never mentioned Ukraine ever, ever, ever. Until 2022, 2023, suddenly they all day long, morning to night, sit and talk about Ukraine and spew and disseminate Russian propaganda. I mean, and I'm talking about like Tim Pool. What does Tim Pool have to do with Ukraine? It's like me or you waking up tomorrow and
Mhm.
suddenly going like from morning to night,
Fox
putting out
1.
disinformation about
Yeah,
Peru. I
right.
mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
like I focus on Russia and Ukraine because, these are my countries. You focus on it because, again,
Yeah.
Tim Pool or Benny Johnson or David Sachs or any of these people. I actually checked with David Sachs. Um, Before January of 2022, he never tweeted the word Russia or Ukraine. After January 2022, he all day long and night. And it's all Russian propaganda. Nazis. I mean, where are there Nazis? We have more Nazis in the United States and on Twitter right now uh, and in
Yeah.
the Republican Party. And that's it. So I don't think he was willing, but again, they don't come and give you a playbook. This is not the type of relationship that they have. They didn't come to him and say, okay, this is what you're going to do for us. No, they sent lucrative money opportunities, made him very favorable. And I don't think at first when I investigated him a decade ago, I thought that they had compromise hanging over him. This is why, he's doing these things. Frankly, I don't think that's it either. I think he truly, because he grew up in Queens, he had properties in near Brighton Beach on Neptune Avenue that his father had Trump Village. This was all for anyone who grew up in Brooklyn. It was all Russian mafia in those areas, Italian mafia dividing the rest of the boroughs, and they had their own sections, and the Russian and Italian mafia in the late 70s and 80s. I mean, they worked very closely together to run many different schemes, from gasoline schemes to, I mean, it was forget it. I think he just happens to love that, like, has that mentality, like that mentality that if someone's giving you trouble, go take care of it, and go take care of it. The person understands. Get rid of them, kill them, throw them in the river, do whatever you want to do. So I think that he loves this. How Putin operates the country. He loves the fact that, if there's an investigation, you silence the people, jail them. If journalists are reporting on something, you don't like it, you get rid of the journalists, kill them, jail them, do whatever it is, but shut them up. to have control of all the agencies and basically dictate the whole country. I think he truly loves it. And this is why you see him acting like this, and why you see him since 2016, at least publicly in political life, siding with autocrats because he just loves that power. It's like a power rush for him to be able to control everything, every agency, and every situation, and have people take care of it for you.
What do you make though of the fact that he hasn't just like you're absolutely right. I think that's very much a part of his personality, but he's gone a little further than that, right? He has stacked his cabinet with people like Tulsi Gabbard. Like he could have put anybody in that role, but he put somebody in who was absolutely just a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda, right? He could have put Lisa Stefanik into that role, who's not a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda. She'd still do whatever he wants, but he chose very specifically a person to put in charge of our national intelligence agencies who is very much I don't know if she's on the payroll. I don't even think she is. I just think she's just another useful idiot. But he chose her for that very specific role. So do you think that was nefarious, or do you think that's just what she wanted and that was part of the deal and he doesn't even realize that what he's doing? Like, what do you make of that?
That I do think was very specific because that is a very specific role. And if you remember in 2017, I believe, I mean, after, all the intelligence agencies concluded that Russia attacked the US elections, it was a very multifaceted attack. I mean, they ran a few dozen operations. What was like one of his first orders of business? We need to establish, joint cybersecurity with Russia, to because they are friends and whatnot. I mean, they just like carried out cyber attacks on the DNC or whatever DNCC DN yeah
The
DNCC.
DNC, yeah. DSCC, yeah, DNC,
And
yeah.
they carried out some multiple cyber attacks. I mean, and the first thing you're like, oh, let's have a joint, cybersecurity task force with Russia, So I think this was extremely deliberate. And interestingly enough, I watched the reaction in 2016 on the Russian side when he won. They were, I mean, literally. So when I say they all like were popping champagne bottles, they were
Of
popping
course. Yeah.
champagne bottles. They were so happy. This time they wanted him in because the only way for them to move forward with Ukraine was to have him back in. But interestingly enough, this time they when he came back, I monitored their reaction. I was like in shock. The first one of their first orders of business was to show Melania practically nude
What do you
on
think that's
TV.
about? To show them who's boss, to show them who's boss, like to humiliate them? What do you I
I
agree with you.
I think it was for him to make sure that he carries out their agenda on Ukraine, and sanctions, because first they did this. Then Medvedev, who's the former prime
Yeah,
minister
yeah.
and president and whatever, and still and was head of the National Security Council, he came out and said, like right around the same time, if Trump attempts to, carry out Ukraine deal in the right way, that he'll be the next JFK. So he mentioned the assassination. Then Patrushev. Now, for people who don't know Patrushev, he used to head the KGB, the FSB. He took it over after Putin. He was the one who, with Putin, organized the 1999 apartment building bombings, killing what 300, like 18 Russians in order to start the second Chechen war. And
In order to come to power, basically, Putin was not sure he was going to
yep,
win election.
no,
He
because
was acting,
Yeltsin,
yeah,
yep.
yeah, he was acting president. He wasn't sure it was going to go his way. These apartment bombings happened. Suddenly, everybody rallied. Basically, everybody rallied. Tail wagging the dog. Everybody rallies against around the flag, and Putin gets in and starts going after the Chechens, which was kind of a jingoistic way to get Russian kind of it really helped Putin consolidate his power. But I do want to ask you this because you also a couple of other questions. One is, what's the Elon Musk role here? Because Musk talks to Putin all the time. What is all of that about?
I didn't investigate Musk, because that's a new figure for me.
Yeah.
I investigated the old crew, Manafort, Roger Stone, but I can tell you personally, because I deal with Ukraine a lot, that in the end of 22, Musk for some reason did kind of a turnaround. I don't know what happened, but around the fall of 22, suddenly the Starlink satellites stopped functioning when Ukrainians were trying to carry out certain sensitive operations. And from there, he started sabotaging Ukrainians via the Starlink, to the point that the Starlink satellites then ended up via the black market. But I mean, it is a freaking piece of electronics. You can track it and shut it off, but it ended up in the hands of the Russians. And Starlink was also being used in drones, Russian drones, to kill Ukrainians. So I don't know what happened in 22, but something happened where he suddenly, became extremely, not only publicly vested in spreading Russian disinformation, with Ukrainian Nazis and all the other garbage that that they were spreading, but also taking steps of like with the Starlink and sabotaging Ukrainians. I don't know where Biden was. I don't understand why no one in the government did anything. And this goes back to your other question with Trump. I don't understand why he never faced accountability. I mean, it is incredible. 40 years he's been moving money for the Soviets and the Russians. And it feels like maybe because it was a counterintelligence operation and the US, didn't want to reveal like the methods and collection tactics, whatever. I'm not sure, but it's the same questions I have for Biden. What in the hell was he doing when Ukrainians were like, sounding the alarm in September of 22, like, hey, this is now going beyond just propaganda that he's disseminating for the Russians. Now he's messing with our, operations on the military field.
But the Russians are basically going on Russian TV every day, very publicly saying that we own Trump, right?
Hmm.
He's our guy. We own him. Like they're not even, whether again, that's just their way of pumping themselves up in front of their people. I don't know. But the reality is they're humiliating him every day,
Hmm.
basically calling them. I mean, he's basically Trump's, Putin's lapdog, if you listen to Russian media. He's now the most powerful man in the world. And whatever Putin has on him, I don't know what Putin could have on him because anything Putin has on him, he could just say is fake news. And
Yeah.
I mean, they could release 100,000 pages of files on him that are 100% true, and all he would have to say is this is fake news, and that would be that. So why is it that he still persists in basically doing Putin's bidding? Because look, I know that he doesn't like Zelensky for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that Zelensky didn't do his bidding when he wanted Zelensky to screw Biden back, during the first impeachment. I know that he's got a tremendous amount of admiration for Putin, just as you said, autocrat to want to be autocrat. But even he knows that Russia is basically a failed petro state, and it's on the ropes. And if this war had gone on another year, I don't know if Putin would even have been there because if there's one thing that Russians historically hate, it's leaders who don't score military victories.
Yeah.
That leads to collapse, right? That's how the Soviet Union collapsed after Afghanistan. That's how the Tsar collapsed after World War One. Like, going all the way back to the Crimean War. If you don't going back to the Russo-Japanese War, if you don't score military victories, like eventually you're out. And Putin, like, he was very close to not having to deal with Putin at all. And for the life of me, I don't understand. You're now the most powerful man in the world, and whoever this guy is that's had all this stuff over you, you have the ability to finally rid yourself of him at no cost to you and truly become the unipower of the world because this massive country that has historically been the counterweight to yours is on the cusp of collapse. Why wouldn't that be something that was appealing to him purely from a power perspective? Why is he still allowing Putin to humiliate him, but putting out naked pictures of Melania by having his people go out on TV every day saying, "Hey, you're a total, you know, basically bitch, who belongs to us. Like, what is it? What is it?
Well, two things. I think one is the fact that this is where he made his money, and you have that nostalgia. I mean, these are powerful oligarchs and businessmen with yachts and glitzy lifestyles and beautiful women, many on their arms. And this is just, something that he's familiar with. I mean, it's like if you have some, wonderful moment in your life where everything was perfect, you kind of always get pulled back to that. So I think that he genuinely, again, loves, the country, loves the businessmen and that lifestyle and the power. And I mean, they all have yachts that are the size of, like, our blocks,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and it's just a lot of power and luxury. He loves luxury. I mean, you see everything around him aesthetically is like gold and like very bling
But
bling.
but he could have that without them. That's what I don't get. Like,
I think it's just that nostalgia because I mean he's been dealing with it, and his both his wives are from the former, Soviet hostage countries. So I think he just loves it. I'm not sure. That's the only thing I can think of. And as far as Putin humiliating him, I'll go a step further. Forget the Melania nude photos. Trump is, brainwashing Americans, and Mega is sitting and treating him as a king, that, oh, I got this Ukraine deal under control and everything is perfect and we're going to do this and whatever. Putin came out himself and said, we never even discussed a Ukraine deal in detail. We don't, I've never agreed to these terms. I never agreed that there are going to be European peacekeepers inside of Ukraine. So every time Trump is bragging what a great deal maker he is, Putin has already made two statements like, no, this is bullshit. Like, we
so I
haven't
don't
even gotten
that's
that far.
I guess that's what really doesn't make sense to me, right? Because Trump is at the apex of Trump probably has more power than any other American president has ever had by virtue of the fact that he controls all three branches of government at the moment. And there's no pushback to him. And so why sit there like a hostage and put up with this? And I'm not is it just that he hates Ukraine so much because he feels like Zelensky didn't perform for him when he needed him to? Is it that
I I think
he sides against the weak as a matter of like just his personality insists that he side with the strong against the weak? Is that what it is? Like, I just it makes no sense to me.
I think that it could be a combination, and I frankly think he hates the United States. Because if you look at the United States starting from 2016, 2015, when he became, very publicly active, he hates the United States. Like, you see this rage, which is very weird, but like, you see this rage towards the United States. It's a shithole country, and everything is horrible here, and everything's falling apart. Our airports are falling apart. And now that there are no guardrails, if you've noticed, I mean, he's like a kamikaze pilot. He literally, the first 30 days of his in office, is dismantling the United States,
Yeah.
making sure that we don't have, I mean, if airports were shitty before, according to him, what's going to happen now when we don't even have air traffic controllers? And if parks were shitty, what's going to happen now when we don't have people, cleaning the parks as spring and summer is coming? So it looks like he's taking revenge on the United States for whatever reason. Maybe
Oh,
because there was.
I have my theory. Somebody in the chat said FDR was more powerful. I actually disagree because FDR didn't have a Supreme Court that said he was immune from federal prosecution. I mean, Trump v. United States means that Donald Trump can do literally anything, including shoot you on Fifth Avenue, as he said. And as long as he's president, it's fine. So no, FDR, as powerful as he was not as powerful as Trump is. My theory as to why Trump um, is behaving this way now is I think he knows. I mean, regardless, irrespective of what he tells his supporters, he knows he lost the election in 2020. And I think this is his revenge. I think he's taking revenge out on people by saying, you rejected me. Now I'm going to get you. I mean, the whole modus operandi is vengeance, right? Like he's doing everything he can to avenge himself and people. It's all he really takes interest in. He's letting Elon Musk run the run the country. The only thing he's interested in is taking security away from John Bolton, and others who can support
Lawyers
him.
who are
Lawyers,
representing.
yeah. He's going after a law firm for hiring Jack Smith. I mean, this is how the president of the United States occupies his time, right? I used to work with John Bolton at Fox. On a personal level, he and I got along very well. He's definitely not my cup of tea when it comes to policy or anything else, but he basically not only took away his security, but also told everybody that he was taking away his security. Translation: Iranians, I took away security. Now it's open season. He's inviting people to murder people like John Bolton. So I think that's what it is. I think all of this is just so much revenge against all of us because we rejected him at the ballot box in 2020. But what I think is one of the most unforgivable sins of the Biden years, to go back to that, is that he and his intelligence people just decided that Trump was in the past, knowing, knowing what the Russians were doing, knowing the disinformation that the Russians were engaged in. Fox went after them for having a disinformation agency. They acquiesced and got rid of it. A woman named Nina Jankowicz. I mean, like really stupid stuff, knowing what the threat was. And I can't tell if they just didn't focus on it or what this was all about, because what a gift to Putin. And now they're all sitting there aghast at what's about to happen to the poor Ukrainians.
It's the same thing with Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Um, I can't tell you, look, Biden did more than any president, US president when it comes to Ukraine, because I mean, Clinton basically forced Ukrainians to give up their nuclear
Yeah.
weapons, leaving them in this position with guarantee of sovereignty. I mean, it wasn't just give up your nuclear weapons because you're nice. It was we with the UK will protect and make sure that your sovereignty is guaranteed. So that happened, and I mean, the failure by Putin saw, I mean, Bush saw Putin's soul in his eyes. I don't know where he was looking. I mean, and with Biden, he did more than any US president when it comes to Russia, but it was still so much shorter than when it needed. Because, I mean, for instance, if Ukrainians, I understand after Afghanistan, maybe in early 2022, the US said, we're not going to provide all these weapons. What if the country collapses? And we don't want our weapons getting in the hands of
Yeah.
Russians. But by the summer, they saw that Ukrainians were literally holding the field. They had secured Kiev. No one ran. The military didn't collapse. The president said, give me weapons. Like, I don't need a ride, I need weapons. Like everything, the country was functioning. And during that time, they still have this, like, DC has this weird Soviet, like, kind of like, I don't know, remembering the Soviet Union, and this weird, like, they formed their foreign policy thinking back from the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And I mean, here you saw that Russia's military is a joke. I mean, the thing was, as Russians were entering Kiev, like they were siphoning gas out of their tanks. Like, who who does this when you?
I've always said, yeah, I've always said, Olga, the best propaganda for the Russian military is war and peace, because it's like, oh, well, we beat Napoleon. Yeah, okay, that was 200 years ago, right? Like those days are
Yep.
over. You lost in Afghanistan. I mean, consistently.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
lose everywhere. And
yeah.
the thing is, Biden, Ukraine could have, this war could have been finished had he, in the fall of 2022, when Ukrainians were basically blitzing through and taking this, instead of publicly with Germany and others, oh, should we send tanks? No, if we do, it might be a red line, maybe not a red line. And having a 6-month discussion about tanks, then these missiles, then that missiles. I mean, everything was done so publicly. beautifully. And I was just sitting like frustrated because every day Ukrainians are dying. They had an advantage during the whole winter of 22. And then, because of all the delays in weapon systems, the Russians were able to move forward, fortify, and really like solidify their control of the front lines, built, bunkers and whatnot. This could have all been avoided. And I think Jake Sullivan was a disaster. This hesitancy to piss off Russia. Like with the Russians, I mean, even just regular Russians. It could be grandma buying tomatoes. You tell her, excuse me, she won't budge. Like you have to kind of shove her to say, excuse me, and then get their attention. Like you have to push back.
Yeah,
There is no negotiations
they don't respect weakness, that's for sure.
at all,
Yeah, and
or negotiations.
or
They laugh at
negotiations.
negotiations.
That's, I always said that like Trump will get far with thugs because he's one himself, and they, thug respects thug, right? Like they respect it's the thug life that they respect. But you know, and I know we're going way over here, and I'm really grateful to people because we've got almost 500 people on this chat live right now, which is amazing. Thank you. And we'll send this out after we're done to people who couldn't join. But I also want to say this: it's obvious that, I mean, Crimea is gone. Fine. It is obvious that whatever happens, if there's a negotiation, that the Donbass is gone. So a third of Ukrainian territory is gone. My prediction, if Trump keeps going, is that Ukraine will remain independent, but they will have elections that Russia will influence. They'll have a puppet. Zelensky will be gone. A puppet will be in place, and within the next 5 years, Ukraine will vote in a referendum, which of course will be totally rigged. To I don't know if they're going to annex themselves to Russia or they're going to do what Belarus is about to do, which is just basically create a whole sort of greater Russian alliance, kind of a confederacy where they're all ruled by Russia. But we're watching the reconstitution here of the Soviet Union, starting with the three Slavic republics, former republics. Am I? What do you think? Am I right about that, or is that kind of too pessimistic, or what
I
do you think?
I would differ with Ukraine unless United States joins like on the side of Russia to fight, Ukraine and help Russia take more territory. I was in Ukraine and I can tell you regardless, I mean the spirit there and the resilience, like there are air raid sirens and music blasting from
Mhm.
bars, like and after Ukrainians lost so much, I mean we're on 11 years of fighting. And then in occupied territories, Russia in 2014, after they occupied them, they set up concentration camps, disappeared Ukrainians. They've
Stole their children. I mean, people have to
tens of
understand.
thousands of children, and people don't understand it's not just kidnapping. I mean, kidnapping in itself is a horrific crime. They are taking Ukrainian children, bringing them to Russia to re-education camps to erase their Ukrainian heritage,
I want people to
language.
understand. Yeah, I want people to understand this because this is really important. This would be akin to Hamas taking those Israeli hostages, those poor children who just died, and raising them as not just Palestinians but pro Hamas fighters. Because that's what they're doing. They're ripping kids. I have a 12-year-old. I can only imagine what would happen if somebody just ripped him away from me and literally sent him to another country to learn to hate me and to learn to hate my country. That's what they're doing. And if you want to know why Putin has been indicted, that's why. I mean, a lot of it has to do with what they're doing to the kids. None of that is being discussed. And for the life of me, I think you have a lot of people around here saying, "Well, how much longer? War. There's war." First of all, we're not fighting, my friends. So like, it's
No.
not. It's for everybody who's like, "We're tired of the war." What's it cost you? And then, oh, we're spending all this money
Five
on
pennies.
yeah, we're spending all this money on Ukraine. You're going to be spending a lot more money
If
when
Europe
this,
falls.
and Europe is going to be spending a lot more money. And good luck, because could you imagine if the Iron Curtain had come down and the Berlin airlift had not happened? Right? That cost money. It cost us money to airlift stuff into Berlin after the war. but we did it because we understood it was for the greater good, because it stood for Western values, because it stood for the Pax Americana, which is now dead. In 6 weeks, it has been destroyed. It has taken him less than 6 weeks. It took him about 2 weeks to destroy what presidents of both parties, from Roosevelt on his deathbed to Joe Biden to Ronald Reagan to Richard Nixon, I mean, name them all, Democrat and Republican, have built up. And it
Yep.
is gone. It is gone.
Yep. That's why Europe, I keep saying Europe needs to step up, because what people also don't factor in, and this again, these are like very typical Soviet tactics, taking family and friends and turning them into traitors and paranoid against each other. In occupied territories, they have been making Ukrainians fight and kill Ukrainians on the front lines. Now, if Ukraine ever fell, you are going to have the Russian army basically double in size, and then these people will be forced under Russia's, captivity to go and fight Germans, to go and fight the Estonians, to go and fight the French. So I mean, you automatically will increase not only just the borders of where you can enter, and attack Europe, the rest of Europe from multiple entry points, just like Russia did with Belarus. They softly annexed Belarus like years ago. I believe like by
Yeah.
2019, Lukashenko is like, here, all yours. And what happened? They used Belarusian territory to launch the 2022 full scale invasion. So, I mean, Europeans don't understand, not only that the Ukrainians, same Ukrainians, that are now fighting for democracy and peace and security of Europe, if God forbid Ukraine falls, Russia will use their families, their children, their wives as hostages and say, you now go and kill the French. Because if you don't, you're not going to have a family left. And they'll automatically double their territory, their expertise. Ukrainians are the best when it comes to cyber and tech. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, so this is why it's such a dire situation. But I am more hopeful because I do think that Europeans understand, and Ukrainians. I mean, you saw when after the full scale invasion, you had like regular, like, moms taking like guns and like shooting down, drones. Like they're not going to go back under Russian occupation. I mean, they will fight tooth and nail before, because it's like, being kidnapped, kept hostage in a freaking basement, raped and beaten for 20 years, finally escaping. And this was what Ukraine was under the Soviet Union. I mean, Stalin killed how many millions of Ukrainians? He starved to death. You finally escape it, and then what? You're gonna, like, to 40 years later, gee, I want to go back to that basement and be raped and
Yeah.
beaten and whatever. So Ukrainians will fight tooth and nail for their like.
And for anybody who asks, I always love this, like, well, Ukraine shouldn't be NATO and Baltic shouldn't be NATO, and the poor Russians feel like they're being
Yeah,
surrounded. Somebody needs to understand, why are these countries dying to be in NATO? You don't see Canada until recently. You've never seen Canada saying, "Oh my God, I've got to join the Warsaw Pact in the 1960s because I'm so afraid of the United States." Right? The reason they want to join NATO is because, as Olga so aptly pointed out, they've been in that basement before and they don't want to go back. This is not a country, Russia, and I'm sorry, I was, I always say Olga had the fortune of having I think your mom's from Kiev, right? And
my
Alexander,
dad.
yeah, your dad, right? And Alex Vidman is from Ukraine. Like you guys, I was born in Moscow. Like I was born in the belly of the beast, so I'm actually Russian. So for me to say this, take me at my word. This is not a country. This is not a people who just will stop. They never have. They're always been about territorial expansion. And the people that know that best were the people who lived under that yoke for millennia, 1 millennia. I mean, literally almost 1,000 years, on and off.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, what you have to understand is that the reason they need to join NATO and they want to join NATO is because if they don't, they will be gone. They will be eaten. And that's up to them. That's why. It's not, nobody's forcing it down their throats.
No. And NATO, how many countries has NATO attacked? Russia has attacked and invaded Georgia. They have attacked and invaded Ukraine from 2014 to the full scale
Yeah.
invasion. They freaking committed the worst atrocities. For several, after the full scale invasion, I started like working with Syrian opposition very closely so we could collect war crimes.
Mhm.
They committed the worst atrocities. They helped Assad murder 750,000 Syrians. I mean, what Russia did there are Russian graves. Even now, Syrians have their country, God bless back, and they're still finding like Russian graves. I'm like, what is this? What does this say? Africa, Africa countries, how many villages that they walk into, propping up, I hate call it the war criminal regimes. The Russians walk in and they freaking rape and murder whole villages and families. I mean, they are everywhere. And then with democracy, since 2014, they attacked the Polish election and succeeded, which basically was, kind of a testing thing for the US 2016 election. German election several times, French election, Estonia, every single election around the world they're in. I mean, this is a group of people that they just don't want to like sit in their own corners. No one else in Europe is looking for expansion. No one's ever crossed into Russian territory. No one's even dreaming about Russian territory. If anything, NATO countries have this fear of like not getting too close and like even to a Russian border, not to send off the wrong signals.
Yeah,
Um,
but the Russian mentality's always been that we're the ones who are always attacked. The Nazis attacked us, Napoleon attacked us, we're just minding our own business. And that is very strong, right? They have a very like, if we don't go first, they'll come for us.
yes,
Which is a psychological, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but that's like a national
it's
psychiatric,
in their DNA,
it's in
and it
their
also
DNA. But to your point, since World War II, nobody has attacked them because since World War II, we've had a very different world order where civilized countries don't just come and grab what they want. Until Donald Trump showed up, until Vladimir Putin showed up, and then Donald Trump showed up, and now we're about to grab, I guess, Greenland from the Danes, and we're about to grab the Panama Canal from the Panamanians. And to my friends in Canada, I don't even know what the hell is going to happen there. But I
we
mean,
will
like,
we will fight on the side of the
yeah, I
Canadians.
mean, like, by the way, I want everybody in Canada to know normal Americans are with you.
Uh-huh. I mean,
We are very happy not having you as the 51st state.
no.
Although we would love your electoral votes, we are very happy going to visit you in your own country. So, like, this is all absolutely
Sovereign
insane.
country.
Sovereign
And
country.
if you noticed, Trump came back, and I mean, if people remember in 2017, like one of his first priorities was trying to get out of NATO. And it
Yeah,
was the likes of Kelly and the rest, Bolton, who basically were served as guardrails,
the
and Trump
bulwark.
didn't
Yeah,
have control of, carrying out his wildest wishes. Now there are no guardrails. And if you notice, the first countries he attacked are NATO countries. He's threatening Canada, a NATO founder. He's threatening Greenland, via Denmark, NATO. So
yeah,
you see, he is literally trying to break NATO and end NATO, at least in one way or another. If he can maybe have it signed off in Congress, then at least he can completely destroy it by making threats and, God forbid, potentially attacking NATO
yeah.
countries.
Listen, the fact that we're talking about potentially having a war with NATO is so surreal to me that all I can say is that I think thank God he's only here for 4 years, although I'm 100% convinced he's not gonna leave on his own. You do a whole tyranny tracker, which by the way, I strongly recommend if people do not follow Olga, either the Trump tyranny tracker or I'm asking Russia. Both of those newsletters are completely indispensable reading. Seriously, follow
Yours
her.
too.
Thank you. If you have the money to subscribe for paid subscriptions, please do, because I mean it. I mean, there's a reason why I asked her to do my first live, because I think she really runs the indispensable stuff on Substack that a lot of people do. So, Olga, I realize we've been at this for an hour and 20 minutes. We should probably let people go on with their day.
I
But
have
briefly, yes,
I have one last
yes,
message. Like when
yes,
it comes to Trump not leaving power, I mean,
yes.
one thing I never understood Democrats, carry on that he's a dictator, rightfully so.
Right.
But then they're like, oh, but there's 2028. I mean, I've never heard of a dictator, maybe you have, who actually leaves when they're supposed to.
Cincinnatus back in the
Yeah.
Roman era,
But
but that's about it. Yeah.
people have asked me, like, will Trump leave? And my answer, as Ukrainian, he will do as much as you allow him to. It is up to the people. So if the people let him sit there till 2030 and then put his son Don Jr. in, then that's what the people want. If the people allow him to start arresting neighbors and Democrats and journalists and whatever, that's what the people want. I mean, Ukraine had two revolutions to fight for their democracy, and peaceful revolutions, until Yanukovych's thugs started murdering Ukrainians, which only energized them more during Maidan, to even, like, the
Mhm.
numbers really were incredible, and like 1 million people were on the streets every day. So it is up to the people in America, when it comes to that. So even though things look dire, when everyone's had enough, we just need to organize. And these people, what we see, regardless on social media or what we see, these are a handful of people. There's a reason that you go on Twitter and you feel like the whole country has turned against you and is nuts and like loony and far right. It's because the algorithms are feeding you the same freaking, 10 influencers who are pushing this garbage. Meanwhile, you walk out in America and talk to regular people, they're just busy trying to pay their bills and take care of their kids and, plan a vacation. So it is up to us. And when we decide we have had enough, and it will happen because he's moving very quick, taking, like, literally hitting everyone, every sector, veterans, Republicans, between job losses and next Medicaid and whatnot. And that's it. So that's my message. And, and we'll be here, we'll help organize, we'll do everything we can to at least, make sure that we don't lose our country to a dictatorship.
Yeah, and let me tell you, as somebody whose grandfather was in the Gulag, as somebody whose great grandfather was shot by Stalin, like if the Ukrainians can fight for their country, knowing that their literal lives are in danger, we should certainly be able to fight for our country where it's not going to cost us our lives. All it's going to cost us is standing up for a constitution. Like we're not there yet.
No.
And we got to nip this in the bud now. And Olga, you're so right about that because a lot of people ask, what can we do? What can we do? There's so much you can do. These members of Congress are not going to be doing town halls much longer because they've been told by Mike Johnson, the speaker, not to do them anymore, according to NBC, because
Bring the
apparently
town hall to them.
bring
I'm
it to
about to
them, bring it to
I'm
them,
about to
get it.
organize one for my Maliotakis.
You
She's
guys,
never had a
literally,
town hall.
rent a VFW hall somewhere for a few bucks. It's like a couple $100 if you can swing it, or just get a room somewhere in some banquet hall, some big room that can hold it. Invite your neighbors of both parties, everybody, and say that we're having a town hall. And then you invite Nicole Melitakis, your congresswoman, or any of these people, regardless of where you live, Democrat or Republican, invite them to come to your town hall. And if they say yes, fantastic. If they're Democrats, ask them what they're doing to stand up to Trump. Saying we're working on it is not the answer. If they're Republicans, ask them what they're doing to stand up to Trump. If they say nothing, then you know. If they don't show up, have your own town hall and talk about why they won't show up because they work
All the
for
local
you.
media, have them
Call the
cover
local
the
media. Call the local media. You guys, I worked on the Hill. I worked for politicians for 30 years. They are scared to death of their constituents. They're scared to death of Donald Trump, but there's one person who can, there's two entities that can get them out of office, Donald Trump in a
perfect.
primary or the
I love
voters in
that.
a general.
Sorry,
So
but put the photo of the rep on the empty chair for your town
yeah,
hall. That is like,
seriously, bring your phone, just like we're doing right now. Record it, send it out across socials. We have the power. Like people always, what can we do? What can we do? I just gave you several things you can do. There's many more. Go to my Substack and check out. I have a bunch of ideas. But the point is, be aware of what is happening. It is now. It is now. If you wondered where you would be during World War II, if you, would you be in the resistance or would you be, a collaborator? Now you know where you'd be. This is our time. This is now. Because if we don't do this now, there are going to be gulags. And I'm not saying this to scare people. It's because this
No.
guy, Olga's absolutely right to go back to what we started. He worships people like Vladimir Putin. He wants us to be like that. And we can't get there.
I
I
mean, you
look,
saw Eric Prince crawled out of the woodwork, for to set up these camps for immigrants. Today they're for immigrants, tomorrow they're for us. I
guys,
mean, this is
I left one country because it was a dictatorship. I don't really want to leave another. Like, please, we got to get this under control. I love this country. Olga loves this country, just as immigrants can, because we've seen the alternative, and the alternative effing sucks. So I'm
yeah.
begging you, do what we said. Get your member of Congress to show up to your town hall if they're not having their own. And if they don't, make it painful for them that they blew you off, because every single penny that you earn, taxes come out of it to pay their salary. As much as Marjorie Taylor Greene says that federal workers don't do anything, she's a federal worker. You pay her salary and all of their salaries. They work for us.
And we
Olga,
can
yeah,
we withhold later on the federal taxes and say, you know what,
yeah.
have a class
I,
action.
We'll
But
see. We'll see. Thank
we
you.
have,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. I am so grateful to you, people who will watch this later. We'll post it. Olga, I hope you'll post it on yours. I'm
yep,
certainly posting it on
definitely.
mine.
Yep.
I'll post it on YouTube. And I really hope we could do this more often, because this was so great. Thank you. And we kind of should set up a series of just Russia Trump outrage live that we do. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining,
Thank
and
you
we'll
guys.
see you later. Bye, everybody.
Bye.